Hello, in this video I want to continue the series that we've been doing up till now, talking a little bit about accelerationism. In this particular video, I want to talk a little bit about accelerationism on the affirmative. Accelerationism on the affirmative I think is really interesting, and one of the areas that I think will be most popular and probably the most popular area you'll see accelerationism in, I think, is really accelerationism on the app in the context of the water resolution. And so I want to talk a little bit about what I think maybe some of the strengths or weaknesses, or what are some of the things that you need to be thinking about if you want to read or write one of these affirmatives, and then talk a little bit about how I think it kind of answers different arguments across different flows, contextual to what I think will be some of the key questions that are raised on this particular resolution that's upcoming. If you haven't, make sure to watch the other videos I've done doing accelerationism, like the intro to accelerationism, or just the last couple of videos to get some of the just ideas flowing about where we are and where you're kind of coming in terms of your background knowledge for accelerationism. Because if you're just hearing this for the first time, this video will not be as helpful in just breaking down the basic concepts of accelerationism, which is why I think that being able to kind of follow along with these videos as we go is really important in order to kind of frame a lot of the conversation that we'll end up having. When we're kind of just setting out the terms of what I think are maybe some of the strengths or weaknesses, or just the general priorities that you should have when you're trying to write or execute an accelerationism on the app, I think the first thing to store out is what is the kind of relationship that you're saying happens between capitalism and tech. Is it as simple as just capitalism is kind of what drives innovation and the way that we control and distribute tech, or is it something like capitalism as it's contextualized to other types of historical violences, whether it be slavery, native genocide, etc., kind of complicate the relationship that technology does, and how it works as kind of a tool of dispossession. And then to kind of speak from those points, I think starting off with how you're theorizing capitalism in relationship to the question of technology is really important and a crucial place for you to first situate a lot of the early considerations that you want to make when you're trying to make an app like this work. Because I think that a lot of the other arguments that you'll see from criticisms, and a lot of the arguments that you'll end up having to make from framework T, really come from your ability to attend to really complicated histories about the relationship between water technology and just human development and uneven human development. And I really think being able to really figure out the particular way in which you're thinking about Marxism, and also how that changes the type of organizing model that you may change taking up in your method later, is definitely a good place to start. I think the next question is then what does the future that your method want to build look like, and what types of examples or tactics can you take from the past in order to make that vision of the future look better or clear. I think that it's really important when you're trying to make these type of arguments to really consider the way in which the type of methodology or world that you want to bring can come from various tactics that don't require you to particularly identify yourself as a part of one particular organization or way of organizing political methodology, but is rather about how you pull from different kind of retoolings or thoughts about the way in which we should relate to technology as a whole, which I think can definitely open you up to a lot of really interesting areas where you can kind of permute the way in which different criticisms kind of take an ulterior relationship to the way in which you're considering technology, but also I think allows you to keep a really fluid response to things like framework T, counterplans and dissads, and other types of policy-based responses to the affirmative that I think are things that you definitely should look out for. I think that when you're trying to figure out maybe what some of the weaknesses are of this strategy, or where you should be looking out for yourself the most, the place that I would start with is usually thinking about the way in which you can be able to answer questions about the way in which you can kind of ensure the type of transition that can happen from the way in which you get from the world that we exist in now to the methodology. And then secondly, really ask you a question of how does futurity deal with the question of time frame, and how it deals with the question of whether or not these futures are distant in the sense of not reachable at all, or whether questions of things that we do in everyday practices, and really defining kind of what accelerationism does as a kind of lens for the future to define the types of political practices that you take up in the everyday. And I think considering that can really help you buff out a lot of the details that I think teams really want to pounce on in order to kind of stop you from weighing your offense in a way that's particularly helpful for you. Then we kind of trying to transition this advice into thinking about how you should be resolving case arguments, or how you should be extending the case as a whole. I really think that you want to make a lot of arguments about why the kind of impending crisis that's coming from the environment, and that is kind of brought by the water crisis, is one and which requires us to find radically different ways of thinking about the current relationships that we have to technology and our economic system. I think that being able to, the more you can kind of lean on the kind of a necessity of like radical transition away from the current system and the limitations of the current system's ability to attend to kind of like that impending crisis. I think that you have a lot of offense to really weigh against all the other flows about why the particular type of methodology you're taking up kind of sits in the best of both worlds in terms of its like preciseness and practicality to resolve these forms of violence, but also the ability for it to kind of open up a different way of like thinking about the way in which we can create mechanisms for like making that future possible outside of the kind of like limitations that are imposed like by the like singular usage of the state, etc., or like only the formal usage of like a vertically organized party, etc., all of which I think are like questions in which you should really kind of be pushing in terms of how you're answering each case argument and how you're hammering out different types of examples and diversifying the types of organizing models, etc., and the tactics that are being used, because I think the more diverse you can keep the types of methods and things that you touch, the easier it can be to kind of like answer like really in-depth questions about like how your methodology responds to like really specific and contextual scenarios that I think other teams will try to bring up to complicate a lot of the debate that's happening here. I think that when you kind of like then switch this on to how we're thinking about like the possibility of a framework in T debate, I think that when you're trying to first figure out what you should do in the framework in T debate, in general, my advice is really always to start with how do you think about the role of debate. I think that you could definitely explain like debate as an institution, but also as one that has had to deal with like the change in way in which we should use technology, i.e. the imposition of Zoom debate, etc., and really think about like how have like the technological like barriers, challenges, and innovations that are pre-created in the face of that also open up like the radical possibility of how we use the space differently, opens up different ways for us to think about like the possibilities of like what the space is supposed to do in order to continue on, in order for it to like fight past like, for instance, barriers to like participation, etc., that like existed because of things like budget cuts, etc., things that exist in like the era of like what transitioned to Zoom during the pandemic. And I think that a lot of these can really start to contextualize maybe some of the ways that you're creating a precedent for like the types of interpretations that you want to read when you get into like the nitty-grittier parts of the framework T debates. I think that when you can maybe spin in an interpretation that makes arguments about like how the only like possible ethical interpretation of the resolution is one that like doesn't rely on the limitations of technology now, because I think if you can win an overwhelming amount of limitations, like the way in which like policy or even the state in general can act as a manager or as like a centralizing institution to control the distribution of resources and technology, the easier it is for you to win why there are like necessary alternatives to that as a mechanism that are good for how we talk about, especially when you're like winning these case arguments that we were talking about before about like why the type of like scale of the crises of like the environment and water really make it so that we have to like find these kind of radical alternatives and make them central to our conversations about water as a whole. Hopefully this video was helpful for you, and hopefully you'll tune in for more. I generally really like doing these videos. We're getting closer to the end of the accelerationist like just section of the videos that I've been doing, and so yeah, hopefully they've been really helpful so far and you'll tune into the conclusion of them. Thanks.